For months, I had been warning the HOA that their constant meddling, trespassing, and baseless complaints about my farm were going to lead to consequences they weren't prepared to deal with. But they brushed off every warning as if I were just some stubborn landowner who didn't know what he was talking about. My farm had been in my family for 3 generations, long before the HOA-controlled subdivision ever existed, and yet these self-appointed community leaders behaved as though they had authority over everything that touched their precious neighborhood boundary lines. The trouble started when they demanded I remove my livestock fencing because it ruined the aesthetic. I politely explained that my property wasn't under their jurisdiction, and that my fencing was legally required to keep my animals safe. Instead of listening, they sent me increasingly aggressive letters, tried to schedule unauthorized inspections, and even walked onto my land without permission, clipboards in hand, taking pictures like they were documenting a crime scene. I filed trespassing reports multiple times, but the HOA president, a woman named Carol, who lived for petty power trips, insisted that the community has rights. The final straw came when they tried to host a community barbecue near the edge of my property and complained that the smell of hay and manure was disruptive. Every time they crossed the line, I calmly reminded them I wasn't part of their HOA, and every time, they laughed it off as if the rules of property ownership didn't apply to them. After one particularly tense encounter, I warned them clearly, if they continued trespassing, I would take legal action and enforce every boundary I was entitled to under state law. They shrugged, scoffed, and walked away like they had nothing to fear. What they didn't know was that I had already begun documenting every incident, collecting every letter, every photograph they took, and every arrogant attempt they made to control what didn't belong to them. They were so used to bullying neighbors into submission that it never occurred to them someone might actually stand up against their abusive authority. But the moment they crossed that property line one too many times, they set into motion a chain of events that would turn the tables completely. They thought they were untouchable because they had titles, a committee, and binders full of HOA rules. They were about to learn that the law cared very little about self-important neighborhood politics and that a farmer who grew up defending his land was someone to underestimate. The escalation happened on a hot Saturday morning when I noticed fresh tire marks cutting through the soft dirt near my barn, leading straight to an area where I kept my feed storage. At first I thought maybe one of the delivery trucks had pulled up too close, but then I found something far worse: an HOA board member wandering around behind my barn with a tape measure, acting as if he owned the place. He jumped the moment he saw me, muttering excuses about surveying the shared boundary, even though we both knew there was no shared boundary and never had been. This incident wasn't just trespassing anymore. This was targeted interference, deliberate and bold. I immediately called the sheriff, who arrived within minutes. The deputy who responded knew the HOA well. They had a reputation for crossing lines with anyone who didn't bow to their authority. When the board member tried to talk his way out of it, the deputy shut him down, stating plainly that he had no legal right to be on my land, and warning him that any future incidents would result in charges. You'd think that would have scared them straight. Instead, the HOA doubled down. The very next week, I received a formal notice claiming that my animals were creating noise disturbances and that I had to remove them to comply with community standards. I laughed out loud reading it because my farm wasn't in their community at all. Still, the harassment became constant: letters every few days, threats of fines, and even attempts to stop delivery trucks from accessing my private road. They held an emergency HOA meeting strictly about me, which I found out only because a sympathetic neighbor sent me a recording. In it, they discussed strategies for forcing me into compliance, and even debated petitioning the county to revoke my agricultural permits. That was the moment I realized the harassment was no longer petty, it was strategic. They weren't just annoying me, they were trying to push me off my land. But they didn't understand one critical thing: farmers don't back down. I hired an attorney specializing in property rights and rural land protection. He was thrilled to take the case because, as he put it, HOAs think they're above the law until someone reminds them they aren't. We compiled every incident into a thick folder: photos, timestamps, sheriff reports, audio recordings, everything. And while the HOA continued their games, I stayed quiet, letting them dig themselves deeper. Little did they know that every trespass, every letter, every attempt at intimidation was becoming ammunition for what was coming next. The breaking point came when the HOA attempted their boldest move, yet sending a so-called compliance team to forcibly remove my fencing. It was early morning when I heard metal clanging and voices arguing near the pasture. When I rushed outside, I found 3 HOA members with tools in hand, pulling at the posts like they had every right to do so. My animals were already spooked, running back and forth as these intruders shouted over each other about how the fence violates neighborhood visual regulations. They weren't just trespassing now, they were damaging property and threatening the safety of my livestock. I didn't waste time. I filmed everything on my phone, called the sheriff again, and this time, multiple units responded. The deputies were furious, not just because of the trespassing, but because interfering with livestock fencing is a serious legal violation in our county. The HOA members were detained on the spot, handcuffed while they sputtered about community, authority, and emergency action. The sheriff shut them down instantly, explaining loud enough for my camera to catch it that the HOA had zero jurisdiction over my land and that their actions constituted criminal trespass, property damage, and endangerment. As they were escorted off my property, Carol, the HOA president, showed up screaming about how I was ruining the neighborhood atmosphere. The sheriff warned her that if she stepped foot past my boundary line, she'd be in cuffs too. That afternoon, my attorney filed a lawsuit. Not a small one, a full civil suit for harassment, trespassing, property damage, and attempted interference with agricultural operations. The evidence we submitted was overwhelming. Every incident was time-stamped, documented, and verified. And because the HOA acted as a group, the liability didn't fall on individuals alone, it fell on the entire HOA organization. When they finally received the court notice, panic spread like wildfire. Multiple board members quit overnight, terrified of personal financial liability. Carol tried to rally the remaining members, but even they were starting to realize that she had led them into a disaster. Then the county got involved. After reviewing the sheriff's reports, the county opened an investigation into the HOA for abuse of authority and illegal enforcement attempts. Turns out, this wasn't their first time overstepping. They had a history of bullying newer residents. But this was the first time someone had fought back with hard evidence. While they scrambled for lawyers, tried to delete posts from their neighborhood group, and whispered about blaming each other, I continued running my farm as usual. The peace on my land felt different now, calmer, stronger. It wasn't just about boundary lines anymore. It was about proving that standing up to bullies, no matter how organized they think they are, always matters. The court date arrived faster than anyone expected, and when the HOA members walked into the courtroom, they looked nothing like the confident, clipboard-wielding enforcers who had strutted onto my land for months. They looked defeated, exhausted, and terrified, especially when the judge read through the list of charges. My attorney presented our evidence with precision: videos of trespassing, sheriff body cam footage, recordings of HOA meetings discussing plans to interfere with my farm, written notices threatening illegal fines, and photographs of the attempted fence removal. The judge's expression grew darker with every piece of evidence shown. When it was the HOA's turn to defend themselves, their argument collapsed instantly. They insisted they acted in the community's best interest, but the judge reminded them that their authority extended only to properties under their jurisdiction, and my farm wasn't one of them. He reprimanded them for blatant abuse of power and violating multiple state property laws. The verdict was swift and brutal. The HOA was ordered to pay for all damages to my property, compensate me for emotional distress and legal fees, and issue a formal public apology. Additionally, several board members were personally fined, and Carol was removed from her position as HOA president effective immediately, barred from serving on any HOA board in the county again. But the real shock came when the county investigation concluded. The HOA was found guilty of multiple violations, resulting in the suspension of their enforcement powers for an entire year. They couldn't issue fines, conduct inspections, or enforce any rules without county approval. Their power, everything they had used to intimidate residents, was stripped away. Word spread fast. Neighbors who had suffered in silence for years came to thank me, relieved that someone finally stood up to the tyranny. Some even joined together to start a petition to permanently disband the HOA or replace it with a resident-elected advisory group. As for me, life returned to normal on the farm. The sun rose over my fields without the anxiety of unwanted intrusions. My animals grazed peacefully, my fences stood strong, and the land felt protected again. But the most satisfying moment came weeks later when I received a letter, not a threat this time, but an official apology signed by every remaining HOA member. They acknowledged their wrongdoing and stated clearly that they would never interfere with my property again. I pinned that letter to my barn wall as a reminder. Not all battles are fought with fists, but with evidence, patience, and a refusal to be bullied. They ignored my warnings, trespassed on my land, and tried to control what they had no right to touch. But in the end, they paid the price financially, legally, and publicly. And my farm, just like my family intended, remained mine to protect.